A wise woman once said, when men talk about defense, they always claim to be protecting women and children, but they never ask the women and children what they think. With this wise word, I welcome you to another edition of the program Leading Women here on Splash 105.5 FM. My name is Oluwatoyin Adepoju. On Leading Women today, my guest is the CEO of Together for Girls, an American-based non-profit organization. Her name is Daniela Ligiero. Why don't you sit back and enjoy my conversation with Daniela? Enjoy.
My name is Daniela Ligiero, and I am the CEO of Together for Girls. We are a partnership that works around 22 countries around the world to try to end violence against children with special attention to sexual violence against girls. And I have been the CEO of this organization for 3 years now. And before that, I had the opportunity to work in a variety of different jobs, including at the U.S. Department of State, for the UN, and for a variety of other organizations. Always trying to... And so I've been doing this job for over 20 years now. And I'm a psychologist by training. And I think there's a lot that I think psychology can bring to this work in terms of trying to prevent violence against women and children. And the other thing that's important to know about me is that I'm a mom. I have 2 kids, a wonderful husband, and I'm also a survivor of sexual violence in childhood. And one of the things that really drives me is trying to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other children around the world.
Well, it's nice to know that you're actually a psychologist. Bringing me to my first question. What is the place of psychology in dealing with violence against children?
Yeah, so I think psychology is really important because at the end of the day, psychology is about behavior. It's about people and the behavior that they engage in, and changing that, helping to prevent violence before it even happens in the first place is about changing people's attitudes, reactions, behaviors. And so, I think for a lot of different reasons, it is important for psychologists to be engaged, to help people understand how their behavior harms others, to help communities change norms where they accept certain kinds of behaviors and actually start to create norms that discourage violence from happening in the first place. And then also behaviors that really support victims, where you can, believe them and support them in their healing process. So I think there are a lot of different ways in which psychologists can make a big difference.
Well, you led the integration of gender issues into all foreign policy and investments in global health, working with over 70 countries. It would be nice to share your experience with me. Tell me your experience about.
Yeah, so that was a really amazing opportunity in the sense that, it really is about thinking at the time about how the U.S. government foreign policy and all the investments that the U.S. government makes around the world in global health could really, think about gender issues and really how it affects girls and women. And so an example I always like to use is HIV. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to struggle with really high prevalences of HIV. And if you think about it, some of that, especially for adolescent girls and young women, is driven by things like gender-based violence or norms that are harmful for girls and women. And so thinking about how to do that, how to integrate that work into HIV programming can really make a difference in terms of reducing HIV. And so it was a concerted effort across all of these countries to think about those issues, about what are the things that really affect girls and women, and how can we do better in terms of the foreign policy to improve the lives of girls and women around the world.
Yeah, your organization, Together for Girls, currently works in 20 countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Eastern Europe. What peculiarity drives your intervention in the African continent?
Yeah, so the partnership, as you mentioned, works around the world. And really our focus is ending violence against children, but with special attention to sexual violence into girls. And, unfortunately, these are issues that exist everywhere in the world. They're not specific to Africa. There's not a single country in the world that's really been able to make a difference and, tackle this issue in an effective way. And so the way we work is we have a model that looks at data, action, and advocacy to help end violence against children. So, one of the things we start always is we look at data and we try to understand what's really going on when it comes to violence in a given country. And so we do these large surveys at national level to understand most of these countries for the very first time, and that's specific to Africa and the sub-Saharan African countries we work in, where most of them didn't have any data related to violence against children. And through the work we've done supporting the government and with our partners, we've been able to get those data so that then there can be an informed, evidence-based and evidence-driven policy response.
Interesting. When it comes to exacting penalties for offenders, especially in relation court proceedings, what has the success rate been like for you?
We don't necessarily do the work within the justice system, but we do have a good sense of how it's working or not. And I will say that most countries are doing very poorly when it comes to conviction rates because the judicial system, the police, are not set up to actually deal with these cases. And so, from the very beginning, from victims coming forward to kind of, say what happened to them and not being believed, all the way through to judges or lawyers who don't take these issues seriously, the conviction rates are pretty marginal. So, this is something I think that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that, a lot of kids and a lot of people don't even disclose that they've experienced violence because they have no trust in the system and that they will be able to get justice.
So what major projects is Together for Girls currently carrying out in the African continent, particularly in Nigeria?
Yeah, so in Nigeria, we supported the government to do the first ever violence against children survey about 4 years ago. And that was really important because for the first time it allowed Nigeria to understand the levels of violence that were happening in the country. And, unfortunately, like in many other countries where we work, the levels are quite staggering and shocking. And so, for example, just to give you a sense, one of the things we found is that about 25% of girls in Nigeria say that they've experienced some form of sexual violence before the age of 18, and that many of them don't ever tell anyone about the violence, and even fewer are getting services. We also found that 15% of the girls who experience physically forced, sex or rape became pregnant as a result. So also very high levels of unintended pregnancy. Anyway, as a result of that, the government launched what they called the Year of Violence Against Children. And there have been a series of programs and projects, like, for example, within schools, within communities, that have started to try to address some of the challenges that we discovered with the survey that we did.
What role does parents play when it comes to violence against children?
Okay, so I think parents play an absolutely essential role in terms of preventing and responding to violence against children. One of the things we need to do is is work with parents so that they can have open conversations with their children about sexual violence, physical violence, that it happens, that they should be a safe haven for children so that children feel open and can talk to their parents when something happens, and to really educate children about the reality that is violence against children, and to create that open channel of communication for children with their parents. I also mentioned that, parents can sometimes be the perpetrators of violence, and we know this from our data. Whether it's sexual violence and abuse, or, for example, much more common, harsh physical punishment for children that's abusive. And so one of the things we also try to do is work with parents early on to help educate them about how to punish children or how to correct the behavior of children in a way that isn't physically abusive, and that there are better ways to correct the behavior of children that doesn't include violence and abuse. The reality is a lot of parents, are very physically abusive towards their children, but they feel like that's something necessary and important to educate children. And we know now from 30 years of data that that's not the case, that in fact it can be really harmful for children, and that there are other ways to correct the behavior of children that don't include harsh physical punishment.
All right, excellent. Now, when it comes to exacting penalties for offenders, especially in relation to court proceedings, what has the success rate been like?
Well, the reality is that in most countries, the success rate is pretty horrible and abysmal. Of course, in a lot of the countries where we work, as you know well, the justice systems are not functioning well overall. But when it comes to children and the abuse of children, they're really lacking. But we've had some amazing success stories. I mean, I'll tell you about the case in Bolivia, one of the poorest countries in South America, where through the work of a couple of organizations in Bolivia, including one that's called A Breeze of Hope, they've been able to work with police, with lawyers, with judges, to really educate them about how to best respond to the abuse of children, to make sure that they have what we call child-friendly courts. The same can be said for courts that are friendly to women and the abuse they experience. And through this process over about 5 or 6 years, they used to have a conviction rate of about 3%, and now the conviction rate is 97%. And these aren't huge investments of money. So it really is about how do you work with the system to strengthen it so that it can be more child-friendly and that you can ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice, because that's one of the main ways to deter other perpetrators from committing in the future.
In case you're just tuning in, you're listening to Leading Women on Splash 105.5 FM. Take a break and we'll be back on the show. Welcome back to Leading Women on Splash 105.5 FM. Well, let's talk about Nigeria. What major project is Together for Girls currently carrying out in the African continent, particularly Nigeria? And how has your experience been in Nigeria so far? I'd love to know.
So we first started working with Nigeria about 5 years ago. We worked with the government of Nigeria, UNICEF, several of our partners on the ground to do this large survey. And it was the first survey of violence against children in Nigeria. And that was really important because I think the government understood after that survey was completed the magnitude, the extent of the violence that was happening. And I will say there's been a lot that's been put in place, but still so much more to be done. I mean, as you well know, I'm from Brazil. Nigeria, like Brazil, is such a large country, so many different states and localized governments. And so it's challenging. It's challenging to really go from the national to the state to the local. And I think that's where some of the bigger challenges have been. We are working with this other partnership called the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and Nigeria has signed on in the last 3 years to be what's called a pathfinding country. So really committing to doing more around prevention, around response, whether it's with community organizations, whether it's with the education system and teachers, or whether it's with ensuring that within your HIV prevention programs, you are also thinking about root causes for adolescent girls of HIV and violence, and with the U.S. government as well on these HIV programs. So there's work that's happened. I will say there's room to do a lot more. And I know there are a lot of challenges Nigeria deals with day in and day out. But I think one of the things that really needs to happen is not only government stepping up, but having community leaders, family members, individuals really step up and say, we want to put an end to this and we each want to do our own part. And so, again, I'm delighted you're having this interview and that you care about these issues, because I think radio, television, media as a whole can actually do a lot more to break the silence, but to also empower individuals to do more in their own lives and their own communities.
All right, thanks for that. Now, have you dealt with situations where parents do not want to prosecute or confront the reality of violence against children? I've had issues where I try to intervene and then parents are not willing to go further in ensuring that their children really get justice.
Yeah.
They say, well, they don't want their children to be stigmatized, and so because of that, they withdraw charges. Or sometimes they don't really want to talk about it any longer. Have you dealt with
Right.
situations like that?
All the time. And I think it's, again, problems we're dealing with here are not like a disease where you have a pill and done.
Yeah.
These are complex social issues with generations of social norms, behind them. And so I think I can understand a parent that wouldn't want to stigmatize their child or have them go through a justice system that perhaps at the end of the day won't give their child justice. And so I think we need to strengthen the justice system, and that's on governments to really invest in that so that it can be a better experience for children. I also think it's important to break the silence around these issues so that victims aren't shamed or ostracized. And I know a lot of parents and families will say, I don't want to bring shame to my family or to my child by breaking that silence. And I think it takes, like it did with HIV, it took a few really courageous people stepping up and saying, I have HIV, I'm HIV positive, and really fighting that shame before more and more people were willing to do that. And so I think fighting shame and stigma is something that's on all of us, not just on survivors to come forward, but on everyone to say, when a child is abused, that shame doesn't belong to the child or to the family. It belongs to the perpetrator. And so I think breaking the silence and really putting that shame on perpetrators is something that all of us have a role to play in. It's the reason I came out as a survivor, and so many people are, talking about these issues more and more. And so I see hope, but there's still a while to go. Yeah.
There's still a lot of work to do, I guess. Now, the boy-child violence has only gotten attention recently. How does it impact on the cycle of violence against children?
It's a great question. One of the things we do is, even though our name is Together for
Girls?
early on we understood that boys are also
Being abused?
victims of violence.
Yeah.
So I was saying, even though our name is Together for Girls, early on we understood that we also need to look at violence against boys. And there's a lot more, for example, sexual violence against boys than we ever anticipated actually happening. And we know this from the data. And so really important to also raise the issue of boys, both because they need to be protected as children from violence, but also because of cycles of violence. As you mentioned, we also know today from data and research that boys who experience violence as children are much more likely to grow up to be violent men and to perpetrate violence. So breaking the cycle of violence really needs to start with children and protecting children and raising awareness and creating a society that is dealing with problems in a less violent manner. And so absolutely breaking that cycle is critical, and it needs to, include boys and men in terms of standing up for violence and also in breaking those cycles.
Now, it seems as if Together for Girls focuses on data gathering and empowering countries with information and advocacy. What has the reception been like across continent? I'd love to know.
Well, again, our experience with these national surveys is that, and just to be clear, at this point we have data for over 22 countries and data for over 10% of the world's children. So we have a lot of it now, something that 10 years ago we didn't have.
Yeah.
And what we see is that most countries at first are apprehensive about doing this, but usually there are a few champions in the government that say this is important and we have to do this, and that's how we're able to do it, because the government needs to request the surveys and be committed to making them public. So having those champions is critical. The other thing we find is that in most countries, people will say, yes, we'll do the survey here, but you'll see that here there's not that much violence happening, or there's not much sexual violence happening, or it's really all, a certain group that's perpetrating the violence. And time again, we find that that's not true. That it's happening at every level, that there's violence in the school, there's violence on the way to school, there's violence in the home, there's violence in the community that goes way beyond armed conflict. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's so much violence with Boko Haram and some of the armed conflict that it's relatively easy to pinpoint that and to say, oh, that's where that's happening. Then to see the survey and to see that actually there's a lot of violence in the home, in the school, in the communities really is an eye-opener. And I think over and over again, we see people underestimating what's really going on. And so for us, part of breaking that silence is showing with high quality data that, this isn't someone's opinion, this is fact. And it's much harder to ignore them.
I like that. Now, how do you ensure the political sectoral interest does not interfere with your objective? How do you ensure that?
Well, that's really tricky. I mean, governments come and go and priorities change. And, I think that's a challenge we have in every country. But again, part of what we do is, if you look at the Nigeria survey, it's not the Together for Girls survey. It's the government of Nigeria's survey of violence against children. And that means buy-in from government, buy-in from civil society. We work very closely with groups in country that are really owning the data, the implementation of the survey, and then the response to the problem, so that it becomes harder to say, oh, this is some outside group that's come in and done it. It really needs to be owned by the country, by the community. That takes a lot of time. I mean, from beginning to end, this process of deciding to do the survey and then having the survey released takes about 2 years. Some people complain that it's too slow, but we feel that that's critical because then it becomes a lot harder for people to ignore moving forward.
What's the one thing critical to put in an end to violence against children? Do you think it's really going to end one day?
I believe it. I know we're in it for the long run, right? Like you said, these are challenging problems, but just because they're challenging doesn't mean we can't do them. I mean, if you think, for example, of child labor, I know there's still issues of child labor in Nigeria and all over Africa, but we have seen such huge decreases over the last few decades because people have decided that a child's place is in school and not working in the field, and there are efforts that have been put in place to start to change that. And, 50 years ago, one might have said that's impossible, and look how far Africa has come on that front. And so I believe it's possible. And I think one of the key issues we need to do is break the silence. Everyone has a role in that, in breaking the silence of what's really happening and then to work to resolve it. But unless we break that silence, this will continue to be a silent pandemic, one that's shrouded in shame for victims, for families, and it really shouldn't be. It should be shame for perpetrators. And so I believe the more we can break that silence and speak out and work together to solve it, the further we can go.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for speaking with Splash FM. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
And that's it on today's edition of the program Leading Women right here on Splash 105.5 FM. Join me next week, Saturday, as I bring to you another superwoman who is actually doing great in her chosen career and, of course, in our environment. My name still remains Oluwatoyin Adepoju. A big thank you to my production crew, which consists of Tolu, my sound engineer, and, of course, my production assistant, Zainab Sani. For questions, inquiries, you can send a text or a WhatsApp message to 0805 733 5451. 0805 733 5451. Have yourself a lovely evening. Bye for now.